I've received some pretty insane stuff. How can he not stop himself? There are these things he's doing, but there's no like point at which he says, okay, that's enough. He's going way over the edge.
If he breaks so many laws rapidly, it'd be impossible for anyone to catch up to him.
He knows that he has some escape plan. He has some backup. He can go to Malta. He can go to some island nation to escape consequences. Yeah, I've heard all sorts of wild stuff, that he's like an asset of Chinese intelligence. In some people's cases, they worried that their lives were in danger. Nothing sacred to him.
Hi, welcome to Web3 Revolution. This is a series of podcasts exploring the decentralized internet. We will bring in active participants and onlookers of this exciting revolution and to have conversations with them. This is a podcast for education and information purposes. We will provide accurate information to the best of our knowledge, but the content should not be taken as investment advice. I'm your host, Hana. You can find me at HanaChanWeb3 on Twitter. It's really hard not to know who Justin Sun is if you're so marinated like me in the Chinese internet space. So who is Justin Sun, or Sun Yuchen in Chinese? He's a high-profile figure in the tech scene. He's a cryptocurrency billionaire, a Chinese national who became Grenada's permanent representative to the WTO, and he's a self-claimed Jack Ma's apprentice. This person, in 2019, spent $4.5 million to bid on a charity dinner with Warren Buffett and ended up having a lunch with him. In the Chinese community, he is notoriously known as Sun Ge, meaning brother son, and Ge actually means cut, the verb cut. People using this nickname to refer him often cutting and trimming money from the poor victimized crypto investors. Recently, The Verge published an article called The Many Escapes of Justin Sun. This investigative piece on Justin Sun discloses a long string of decisions and problematic actions by Sun throughout the years, including how he managed to manipulate the market and escape regulations in both China and US. Justin has a large following in both countries, and he's certainly very, very influential. After this piece was published on Verge, it quickly created an earthquake effect in the Chinese crypto and tech community. People were discussing this all over my internet WeChat group, which is equivalent to WhatsApp or Messenger, and this story was quickly translated to Chinese even before Verge did it. And every detail in this piece is discussed and probed, and many articles also came out just to respond or even counter this piece. I personally love this piece, and the ending quote struck in my mind. If he breaks so many laws rapidly, it'd be impossible for anyone to catch up to him. So the question comes here. How can we comprehend Justin Sun, a person who speaks so much about the crypto hype, the speculation, the bubble, even the worst part of this industry, and how can we understand him in the context of contemporary China and US society? So today, we have Chris Harland-Dunaway, a freelance reporter from The Verge, to join us, and who is also the writer of this piece I just discussed, to talk about how he created this piece throughout the investigative journey. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you very much for having me.
I guess I will start with my first question.
Mm-hmm.
So back in September 2020, you wrote your first piece about Justin Sun, and the title is Hype Man of the Century, which is also a fantastic investigative piece, which was also equally influential. In that piece, you disclose the shady history and the stories behind his decision of acquiring BitTorrent and all the hype of the Warren Buffett launch, including the Tesla hype. So tell me, why Justin? Like, how did you get interested in Justin Sun, and why did you want to write a piece about him back in 2020?
It was complete chance. I ran into a former employee of Justin's at a friend's house, and we were talking, having a glass of wine, just chatting, and they began to tell me about this job they had and their boss, who was Justin. And immediately they were telling me all these insane anecdotes about him screaming at people, just hurling verbal abuse, and they started walking me through the whole Warren Buffett saga, which I had never heard of, and talking about how it's still not understood what was really going on behind the scenes. And it was incredibly intriguing, just from a pure, just the plot of what happened in this story as I looked at it, or as I was told this was crazy, was ridiculous. I was like, how much of this is true? I wanted to know that. But also, when I first was told about Justin, in this chance moment, it was a time where people of power, billionaires, tech executives were just beginning to, or not beginning to, but were being held to account for their decisions, for their actions, for their personal behavior. And from what I had heard from this former employee talking to me, was this is a person who seemed to me at the time to totally mistreat his employees in a pretty egregious way. And I wanted to know why. And I often think that people of power who mistreat the people they work with, there's some reason why they do that, often buried deep within them or from their past. And I was incredibly interested in trying to understand Justin better, understand where this behavior came from. Because, as I learned more and more about him and I started reporting and I started talking to other former employees, this question kept on popping up in my mind. It's like, how can he not stop himself? There are these things he's doing, but there's no point at which he says, okay, that's enough. And he sort of takes a step back. So I wanted to understand, there are these people of power who just cannot stop themselves from doing absurd things or doing, absurd things. And I wanted to understand why. And so I certainly had a human interest in it in terms of understanding how someone turns out this way. But also, it struck me as a very clear labor story. There's a whole workplace of people who are dealing with someone who behaves this way, who, mistreats them, who hits them. And so I wanted to learn more. That was the start of the whole thing, really.
Exactly. So that piece came out in 2020 during China's 996 working schedule controversy. And that controversy received more media attention in the West at the time. 996 is a labor scandal in some companies in China that it would force the workers to work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. And that schedule became notorious later. And I believe Justin Sun at the time brought this toxic working culture to the US, right? But in general, this is incredibly amazing. You turned a dinner table story into this fantastic piece of investigative journalism. The details in the piece are astonishing, but I assume you must face a lot of pushback. You have interviewed 15 current and former employees and draw from hundreds of pages of leaked documents. Can you tell me what is the most challenging thing you have faced when you were getting those evidence?
The biggest challenge is when someone wants to tell you what happened because they very clearly recognize something of importance took place, that they experienced, that they witnessed firsthand, but they don't know whether they're ready to tell a journalist about it. And it takes a lot of trust to just decide to do that. So I spent a lot of time talking to people off the record, for weeks, just talking. Sometimes it would just be conversations about random stuff. We'd also talk about Justin, we'd talk about Tron, Poloniex, BitTorrent. And I think helping them understand where I'm coming from with this reporting project and how the process of journalism works, it just takes time. I think time is the biggest challenge for building a deeply layered account about what happened in any kind of workplace or inside a place where people don't want you to go. But also there's just so many people who will not talk to you. And there's so many leads you pursue that end up at dead ends. You might spend 2 weeks working on one lead and trying to talk to 15 people, and they all hang up on you. Or they talk to you a little bit off the record, but they're not willing to talk to you on background, which is sort of the next step up, which is where their names don't appear in the piece, but information and quotes can be attributed to them. And they're often referred to as, a former employee or something like that. So that's a huge challenge, helping sources understand where you're coming from, what you plan to do, and what the point of it is. A lot of people don't see much reason to speak out, to take a risk, whether it's professional, like they're afraid that they could be blacklisted out of crypto, or in some people's cases, they worried that their lives were in danger for talking to me about what we spoke about. So it's funny, that was incredibly difficult, incredibly time consuming. But at the same time, for the first story, 18 current and former employees talked to me. In the second story, 15 current and former employees talked to me. And I mean, that's a lot of people to talk to a journalist about sensitive stuff inside a company or inside some crypto mogul's empire. It's really a testament to how things end up between Justin and his employees. This is not a one-off disgruntled employee. These are, dozens of people who either felt mistreated or felt that Justin was doing things that were potentially illegal or just making terrible business decisions. It just runs the gambit. Or they were personally insulted by them or personally hurt by Justin, excuse me. So that's the biggest challenge, is really just finding people who are willing to talk to you openly and candidly, and earning their trust takes quite a while.
Yeah, and for a lot of people who experience this traumatic working place abuse, a lot of people, they just want to move on. They'd be like, why would I want to discuss with you?
You're so right. You're so right. In fact, there were some employees who call it being traumatized.
Oh, wow.
Traumatized. They would finish working there and just did not want to revisit it. So there were people I approached who initially just didn't respond to me, but later on, some were willing to revisit what they saw, what they witnessed, what they experienced while working at Tron or BitTorrent or Poloniex.
Yeah, I can certainly see why they want to erase that part of their memories.
Yeah.
And not wanting back to revisit. Yeah. I mean, personally, have you got any retaliation or threats?
I haven't received any threats. Nothing strange like cars parked outside my house or people passing veiled threats or nothing like that. I've never received anything like that. None of my sources have been threatened. Sources certainly fear retaliation very deeply. The only threats that I and the Verge received were legal. That is, Justin's team, the law firm Harder LLP, which is a firm owned, or the main partner is Charles Harder, who is famous for suing Gawker, this gossip publication. And he represented Hulk Hogan, I'm pretty sure, in this invasion of privacy case. Basically, I think is what it amounts to. And he took down Gawker. Gawker went out of business. And so now he will represent powerful people. He represented Harvey Weinstein. Harder LLP was responsible for pursuing Ronan Farrow at the New Yorker and trying to threaten him legally to make him stop his reporting on Harvey Weinstein, and the same with the New York Times. So that's the kind of work that Harder LLP is, that's a fact. That's the sort of representation that they've had in the past. So Justin has retained them, and they sent us letters and pointed out how certain things might be defamatory, demanded that we give them all sorts of things. And working for The Verge, reporting for The Verge, that was amazing. Is really a freelancer's dream, is that as soon as reporting started getting into really sensitive areas, I talked to my editor, Kevin Wynn, and I said, hey, I'm concerned about whether Justin will want to pursue me legally, will want to pursue us legally. And he said, we've got your back. We've got your back all the way. And there are media companies, news organizations who will not do that for their freelancers. They will say, you could be on your own here, buddy, but that's certainly not The Verge has been. They're incredibly generous and supportive, and I'm just thankful that I was working with them, because it made it honestly possible to do this story. Because, I mean, you get a scary letter from a law firm saying that you're defaming someone with $1 billion+ I mean, I'm not going to lie. It's like, it's a surprise when you get that letter, even though, I'm doing my darndest to understand Justin. I have no malice towards him whatsoever. I'm just interested in him and the workplace. And I believe that he should be held accountable for what he does. And you're doing the reporting all the right ways. You get a letter like that. It's still very surprising. So to have lawyers from The Verge and then a lawyer that they brought in from Ballard Spar, which does a lot of media cases, to reply to these letters. And they just took care of it. They basically told my editor and I, towards the end of the reporting, just do what you normally do. Just do the reporting, ask for final comment, follow what you would do with anyone else. And so we were able to do that without fear. So.
Wow, that's amazing. That's why the story is so deep and bold and, influential. I want to go back to Justin Sun himself. Till today, he still has a very solid fandom in China and maybe even in the US. Some people just buy in him. And how would you describe and interpret his existence?
That's a really good question. There's something irresistible about, his sort of bad boy attitude. He's totally nothing sacred to him. He has this sort of shit posting side of his personality that people find amusing, hilarious. He can be quite good at laughing at himself. He can be quite funny on his own. He can make jokes that have double layers of meaning that are pretty clever, which doesn't preclude him from being incredibly cruel and saying very cruel things to people. But I think that if you're in the crypto sphere, there's something that can be quite appealing about him. Like when he first bought Poloniex, former employees were pretty stoked about it because there was this sort of swagger that he brought to the way he does business that some people find incredibly compelling. The other part of him, the part that people describe as him being a con artist and taking money or allegedly insider trading, that comes from there's one source who in the second story I wrote said, crypto's awash in naive people and con artists can spot that a mile away. And there's also this idea that, there's a small number of people who will actually go and take advantage of huge numbers of believers in Web3 or crypto. And, if the regulatory framework for the industry is strong enough and if enforcement is strong enough, it deters those kinds of people or they get caught. And so I think Justin, in some ways, is a symptom of this burgeoning, exploding space where there's not a lot of regulation. There's not a lot of law enforcement. We've only begun to see that, the past few years, but it's been the Wild West for a long time. And so I think it's really no surprise that someone like Justin emerges in a space like this.
Right. And after your piece went viral on the Chinese internet, I saw this really funny comment saying, whatever Justin does should not be surprising to us anymore. Even if he posts on Twitter that he wants to unify the galactic empire, we should treat it with normality. Yeah. And I think he posted something like he wants to run for the US president to justify himself, something like that. And it's such a smart or surprising move because at one time it pleased a lot of Chinese internet users by playing this nationalistic stuff. Because when you are a playful person to run or to play with the US election system, you're basically denouncing on how corrupted or how ridiculous the US election system is, right? And he also said something about purchasing the Chinese Uber, Didi. So when people lost their money in the crypto space, they can still be an Uber driver in China.
I didn't know that one.
That's all those funny things.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. How would you react to his ridiculous, posts right after your piece is being, discussed?
I don't know. It's funny because in a lot of cases involving, powerful people in any industry, when there's a tough piece that comes out about them disclosing true accounts of abuse of power or whatever, they tend not to really acknowledge the story very directly. If they do, it's like a very rigid response. But the story went up. Justin tweeted a response, that was much more legally based, but he also put out a tweet that said in all caps, YOLO Polo. So on the one hand, he's saying these allegations are totally bogus. On the other hand, he has this tweet which is making light of this idea that comes out of the Poloniak section of the story, which is that he was going into gray areas, crossing lines, doing things that are allegedly illegal. So I think he's actually, from a hype perspective, pretty smart, because he's parlaying negative news into a spectacle. And what better way to pump up that spectacle than to say, well, one way I can put right against the Verge or retaliate against the Verge is to become US president and then find a way to crack down on them. And you're right, like there's this also nationalistic thing I've heard from sources who, some are China watchers and some are just Chinese and live in mainland China. And they sort of describe him as sort of wrapping himself with the flag a little more in response to the story, which I think makes sense. The story does show factually that he's pursued citizenship at these small island nations. He doesn't come across as terribly enthusiastic about CCP policies and socialism with Chinese characteristics. He told an all-hands meeting the story of him escaping China and how he was sort of sticking it to authorities. And so, I mean, if that sort of news is out there and it's a very reliable account as it is, it's told to me by many sources, it's like, I think you sort of, if you're Justin, you probably need to find a way to make good pretty quick, And so the things that, so this is a long way of saying that him saying nationalist stuff or borderline clever nationalist stuff like what you were talking about is not super surprising to me. It seems like a smart thing to do.
Right. It seems like he's really smart with wrapping himself with different kind of flags, right? In the US, he's a victim of this purge of Chinese entrepreneurs because of racism, right? In China, he is playful with the patriotic or nationalistic narratives. I want to, actually draw this conversation to geopolitics, and maybe we can talk about race in particular. Is for a lot of people, especially the Chinese crypto community, the reason why they maybe hesitant of celebrating your Justin Sun piece is because they feared that this piece would be the COVID-19 of the crypto world, and this piece or Justin Sun himself would overrepresent the Chinese crypto people in the Web3 world, igniting hates or distrust against Chinese developers. So how would you feel about that? What's your take on race and nation and the origin with the current geopolitical atmosphere, and that's impacting
Totally. I think it's an important thing that my editor, Kevin Nguyen, and I talked about from the beginning when we worked on the first story. How do we get that part of the story right? Because you're right. Like, we did not want to cast, like, if he was actually emblematic of Chinese tech culture, we need to find out if that's true. If he's not, we need to find out if that's the case. And so the sources for the story are incredibly diverse. Tron, BitTorrent, Poloniak are incredibly diverse companies. There are Chinese employees, there are Chinese American employees, there are every varying shade, people who are Chinese who came to the US at various times in their life have a different melding of cultures between both countries, and Americans who went to work in China and came back with an understanding of what tech culture is like there. So I basically asked the same questions a lot. And what I learned is that Justin, and this is in the first piece, even by standards of tech developer culture in China, is an outlier. He is not really representative of what these business people are like, what these developers are like. That was something we wanted to address in the piece. And I'm not surprised that there's the fear that this would broad brush the entire Chinese crypto community. That's why I wanted to make this story a very focused, specific story about one person, and where he did intersect with these bigger geopolitical issues, report the hell out of it. Talk to as many people as possible about what's going on there. Because it's like you said, it's complicated. I mean, when the first story came out, it was like in the midst of the trade war, which was incredibly divisive between the US and China. American tech companies have been thinking about disentangling their supply chain from China and things like that. So yeah, no, I mean, I think you're bringing up a thorny question. We tried to be as careful as possible about it. One thing that differentiates the Chinese and American crypto industries, they're part of the same industry, but they operate in different regulatory environments. So that distinction is like, has an impact on what people decide to do with the technology, in both places. So perhaps I think the best thing that can come of stories like this is for people to investigate the system that surrounds the industry in the place where it emerges. Because at the end of the day, deep inside, we're all really pretty darn similar. And you can go anywhere. There's going to be con artists anywhere. That's sort of like one of these sort of smaller themes in the story, is that Justin is an exception, but in terms of human behavior, he's not an exception. You're going to find people like him anywhere. So I think it's complicated, but we tried our best to make sure that it's clear that it's really Justin here. But I think that your question brings up totally germane subjects that deserve further exploration.
Yeah. Thank you for acknowledging that. Also, remember a few days ago, Time Magazine has published an article about Vitalik, and I saw some comments on Twitter. The way that Time Magazine took the picture of Vitalik is a way of somehow othering him, portraying him as more like eccentric tech person rather than a regular, normal entrepreneur or a technologist. So that's another interesting aspect of how do you want to portray or register certain foreign-born entrepreneurs in a way that's you can like represent them fairly or fully, instead of reduce them into certain stereotypes.
Fully, for sure. I think it totally does. It totally does, because yeah, I've seen the Time cover. It's sort of like zoomed out on him. It's not a tight portrait. You can see like his head down to his waist, I think, and he's sort of like slightly hunching, and like they sort of have shown that he's kind of an awkward, nerdy dude, and I think that it's like for sure a symptom of the mainstream holding cryptocurrency and holding the ideas of Web3 and decentralization at arm's length, and sort of holding it out there and being like, look at this crazy thing going on. So I think that's for sure part of it.
Absolutely. I agree. I've seen like too many pieces implying China is weird, and too many pieces implying crypto is weird. I think, Justin Sun is somehow standing on the intersection of it, and like covering him is definitely a daunting task. And I have to say, you actually did a really, really good job in terms of like not implying, that specificity of,
Thank you.
Of that. Yeah, let's move on to the next question of regulations. One of his charges drew our attention, which is failure to register security, or whether crypto is a security. So this question has invited numerous debates, right? It seems like so far every failure to register charges brought by the SEC has ended with a settlement. So therefore, there's no legal conclusion regarding the crypto status. From your perspective, do you feel like the FBI and SEC would be making an example out of Justin Sun, since your piece is so influential?
Man, that's a good question. I don't know. I certainly know that the FBI has read my piece before. A source told me that. I don't know. It's just so hard for me to know what sort of influence this piece would have on them, because they have a grand jury investigation underway already. And from what I understand, that began before even the first piece came out. So they were sort of independently on it. But I think that the main area where they might be encouraged is on the Poloniex side of things, because where I talk about Operation Couch Cushions, where Justin seized or directed Poloniex to seize Bitcoin from users, there are links in the story to the blockchain transactions that show this happening. It's like very concrete. If you wanted to write an indictment for theft by conversion, if I were the lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, but if I were the lawyer writing that, I would consider using that blockchain information because it's like very clear. It's the immutable ledger after all. So far as the securities debate, it's not resolved in a clear way where crypto companies can take a decisive, reliable course to ensure that their tokens are not securities. The settlements tend to indicate that these crypto firms acknowledge that they were securities, but it's like you said, it doesn't leave a clear judicial opinion in all cases that they were securities. A lot of people follow Ripple and XRP. That thing is just like going on and on and on. On the other hand, securities law is quite old. It's quite refined. There's so many precedents. There's the Howey test. There's so much case law. The lawyers I spoke to all said to me, look, most of these things are securities, and it's just going to take time to figure that out. And, it's honestly based on people in the industry I've spoken to, but these lawyers also, is the SEC just hasn't issued clear guidance on this for so long that it's contributed to this impression that it is totally unclear. That said, a lot of lawyers, including lawyers who work for crypto companies that are very, very generous in how they interpret securities law, have told me, yeah, a lot of these are securities. But what's interesting is some of these tokens can begin as a security, but then ultimately become a non-security, because once the network is fully decentralized, whatever the project is, when it's fully decentralized, it's not relying on any human beings at all. There is a point at which it can transition from security to not a security. And so a lot of people point to Bitcoin itself as an example of that. But yeah, I think the question you're raising may be most decisively answered by the XRP case. If it ever goes to trial, like that could be the big one, the big line in the sand that's drawn on this type of thing.
So there's no doubt that Justin Sun collected many titles for him, including this strange ambassadorship of
Grenada.
Grenada.
Yeah.
Grenada, I've never heard of this country before, and I learned about this actually from Justin Sun. This ambassadorship, formerly known as this permanent representative to the WTO. We don't know whether Grenada's permanent representative grants him any diplomatic immunity. Assuming it does, this diplomatic immunity should only work in the hosting country, in the case Switzerland. So do you think he misread the law and just got this ambassadorship because of the confusion? Or what do you think is most likely to be his motivation of acquiring this ambassadorship?
Based on what people have told me and what I've seen, one part is, yes, diplomatic immunity. Second part is he's tweeted about how one of the best ways to advance the independence of crypto, as he puts it, independence of crypto from regulation, is to persuade nations to adopt really generous regulatory frameworks to treat these cryptos. So put another way, put very glibly, is he wants to change policy for some nations, presumably small nations like Grenada or St. Kitts or the Caymans or Seychelles, to change their laws to protect the crypto industry as he prefers it. That's what comes through in his tweets when he talks about why he's doing what he's doing with this ambassadorship. The diplomatic immunity thing is weird, though, because it's very likely not anywhere near as strong as a claim as he thinks it may be. But he may know that it's not a super strong claim. So first of all, what really matters is, does the U.S. confer diplomatic immunity to him? Because diplomatic immunity is a complicated thing. It depends on other countries recognizing it. And so I don't know, but there is something called a white list that the State Department has, which lists everyone who's recognized as a diplomat, and potentially would be extended diplomatic immunity. I haven't seen that list, but if someone wants to send me that list, they know where to find me. So far as the WTO and Switzerland, when I asked the WTO for comment, they said that they're not the ones who confer diplomatic immunity. So then I asked the Swiss Foreign Ministry, what's the story? Where does he get diplomatic immunity location-wise? They said, well, so long as he's an appointed representative to the WTO and he's here in Switzerland for WTO conferences or in the course of his business for the WTO, Switzerland will recognize his status and he'll have diplomatic recognition in that case. But he has to be on WTO business. He can't just be chilling by Lake Geneva, But what the Swiss authorities also said is if the host, the sending nation, Grenada, changes whether or not he's a representative or not, then Switzerland can bounce him. And this is crucial, if a third country, through the course of their prosecutorial inquiries, transmits official message to the Swiss authorities that he not be recognized, that is a legitimate case in which Switzerland will not recognize some form of diplomatic immunity for him. So what's that mean? Over the course of this grand jury investigation by SDNY and FBI and IRS, if they send a letter, if the Department of Justice sends a letter to Switzerland and says, we believe this guy has committed crimes, this is what we are planning to draw up an indictment against him for, or something. I don't know exactly how that communication process works, but if they did that, that is a case in which Switzerland would not recognize his diplomatic immunity. So it's not an absolute immunity is really the big point.
It feels like the protection he was seeking out of this diplomatic immunity only covers a very, very specific scenario, and it's not going to be protective, at all. Basically.
Yeah, it's not going to be protective at all. Though, and this is going to be annoyingly vague for you guys, I can say that from talking to sources on background, he has already been attempting to use his diplomatic immunity in various legal disputes that he currently has going. So it's something he's trying to use, but does it work is another question.
I see. It's funny that, okay, so Justin Song, just from reading your two pieces, he has enough problems himself. And now stray rumors said Justin is now residing in Hong Kong's really famous four-season hotel and gambling all day. And also rumors says he's trying to, use some gambling profits to pay his debts withdrawal.
I hadn't heard that. That was interesting.
Yeah, I'm just really curious. How would you assess his risk tolerance? As a person, if I were in his shoes, I wouldn't chill in four-season hotel in Hong Kong and gambling all day.
It's funny you say that because one source told me that he, for a time, and this is a former employee told me that he, for a time, lived in the Rosewood in Hong Kong. I don't know if he's moved to the Four Seasons or what, but the Rosewood is this brand that is the brand that rich people don't know about. It's the ultra rich know about the Rosewood brand. So anyways, that's what one person told me, another rumor about his whereabouts. But I could believe the Hong Kong thing based on what I've heard. I don't know about the gambling. I know that when he was doing business with Poloniacs, he would stay nearby a casino outside of Boston. That's all I really know about that's gambling adjacent or close to gambling. I don't know if he's a big gambler or not. I don't know. But he's a gambler regardless. in the more abstract sense, his risk tolerance is truly remarkable. It's risk tolerance that seems calculated, but not in a way you'd expect. It seems like risk tolerance because he knows something we don't. He knows that he has some escape plan. He has some backup. He can go to Malta. He can go to some island nation to escape consequences or to attempt to escape consequences. That's the sort of calculation that seems to inform his risk-taking more so than I'm going into this gray area in crypto law, for example. Can I find a lawyer or can I push it right to the edge? It's not like that. He's going way over the edge. Operation Couch Cushions, taking money from users, is way over the edge, So that's a level of risk taking that is like you said, it's gambling, and he must know something, or we know for a fact that he has backup places he can go. He said out loud, if I get in trouble here, I can just leave the US. I won't come back to the US anymore. There's no doubt that he's very good at finding opportunities to go into the gray area or to cross the line, and he's so good at doing it so quickly that it's hard to keep track of what he's doing. I mean, there's other things that have been reported that are unrelated to illegality or anything that are just surprising that you'll see in the news, like when he suddenly withdrew over $1 billion from the DeFi project Aave, and you're just like, how much money is this guy moving around at any given time? It's a lot. Based on the documents that were leaked to me, I was able to see a lot of money moves around all the time. Like this guy is moving stuff all the time, and maybe moving fast could be a way that makes him feel better about the risks he takes. But again, I can't get inside his head. But the best I can understand through what employees told me in the documents and what we see is that it is calculated, but not in a way we necessarily expect.
Right. When the Chinese government wants to arbitrarily detain some tech moguls in China, some people's classic escaping route would be go to the US. But Justin, he went to the US and he had to escape from the US again. And I just feel like Justin refreshed the record or the classic escaping route for many more people.
It's unusual, right? Because it appeared that he ran to the U.S., but then he seems to have completely burned his bridges with the U.S. But what's interesting about the geopolitical situation that we find ourselves in right now is if you burn your bridges with the U.S., that could totally endear you to the Chinese authorities, because they would be. It's possible they would be stoked that you're a thorn in the U.S.'s side, given the state of relations between the two countries right now. So you're right. It's it's a strange twist on a playbook that we thought we were familiar with, but now who knows? And it's unclear to me how safe he is with the Chinese authorities right now, how close he is to them, how okay they think he is, how accepting they are of him. It's not clear to me at this point, but which is sort of what explains why there's small island nations he claims citizenship for.
Yeah. One more interesting or complicated layer is another street rumor, by the way. People say, oh, Justin is actually a spy sent by the Chinese government to infringe the U.S. laws. And
I've heard that before. Yeah, I've heard all sorts of wild stuff that he's like an asset of Chinese intelligence. I've never found anything that backs that up. It just seems like he has an incredibly complicated relationship with every nation he's ever been in contact with. So, but I'm not surprised that that's a rumor.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I love the Verge cover art for your piece, where he's hanging on the string of things, and all the visualization of him escaping from one place to another.
I'm glad you liked that. The art department had a lot of fun with that. those are all 3D printed figurines, and the art director has now hidden the figurines around the office so that people will sort of like run into them accidentally, and all of a sudden they'll find Justin there with like, 2 bags of cash, or jumping out of a safe, or jumping out of a bank vault. Yeah, it's pretty funny.
That's so funny. So Justin's son is a perfect example of all the crimes one could commit, specifically in the crypto industry. His crime could be categorized in 3 parts: fraud against the public, securities fraud, and fraud against the government. What do you think was the progress on his charges?
I don't know about the progress on the charges. I don't know if anything that has come from the investigation is being turned into an indictment or anything like that. I do know that in the investigation itself, they have very specific targets. They're pursuing very specific entities. Their inquiry is very focused. They have specific things that they're trying to gather evidence on. And I know that because that's in the subpoena that I was shown, and I have. That's what a lot of the reporting was based on for the grand jury investigation. The evidentiary targets of the investigation are not something that I disclosed in the story because it could credibly harm an ongoing investigation. It could spur witnesses to destroy evidence, things like that. The specifics were not in the public interest to disclose necessarily because I don't know much about them. There are things that were on the subpoena that I read and I was like, what? What is that? I don't know what that is. I don't know what they're talking about here. I don't know what this entity is. And so like it honestly required much, much more reporting if I was going to talk about those things that were in the subpoena. So I know that it's focused, it's targeted. They know where they want to look. I know that for a fact. I think more broadly, understanding grand jury investigations can be helpful. The way grand jury works is you assemble basically a jury of people, and the prosecutor lays out the charges that they want to explore, and they can add charges that they want to explore as time goes on. But they basically are asking this jury for permission to do things, investigative techniques that they require permission for. For example, wiretaps. For example, sending out subpoenas for specific things that are sensitive, like banking information. So they're working hand in hand with the jury. The jury hears what the prosecutor's case for why they might want to pursue a piece of evidence. And then they say yes or no, or yes with qualifications. Also, there are people testifying in front of the grand jury. So someone will come in and testify for, I don't know how long, a day, maybe many days. And the jury listens to that information, and then the prosecutor is able to ask following questions. Should we charge this person with this specific crime based on what you've heard from these witnesses who have come into the grand jury? So that's a long way of me telling you that this process can take a long time. I got the subpoena a long time ago, before disclosing it in the story. And so they've been at this investigation for months, and I have no idea where they are with it. But it's just another way of saying that the wheels of justice turn slowly and these investigations take time. So
I see. I guess my last question would be, Justin sort of publicly responded to your pieces. It seems like even though he's maybe chilling in Four Seasons in Hong Kong, your piece cannot really stop him from doing all those questionable actions. Are you going to keep following him with your reporting, or what's your
that's a great question.
Next?
The unsatisfying answer is it depends. After the story came out, people have approached me with new information. The question is whether that can become a second story, or whether it can become a third story. I'm working on it. I've received some pretty insane stuff, and I am looking into it, trying to find out if it's true, trying to find out if there are more people who can tell me about it. It's been difficult reporting on Justin. It's been a long-term project. I would like to write about other things in crypto, report on other things in crypto. I've had a couple other crypto stories going on in the background this whole time. I'd like to make progress on those stories. Crypto is a wild space. It's reinventing the financial industry in some ways, but also it's not. It's encountering the same problems of the nascent, the way finance began for all of us, re-encountering the same questions. And so inevitably interesting things happen when that happens. So I would like to report on that. I think it's a very interesting, special time we've been in the last, I don't know, for me, between 2016 to now has been very interesting. So I would like to continue to report on the people inside the space, tell specific stories about what they're doing. But yeah, a third story about Justin could be possible. I don't know. I'll have to see what I learn.
Wow, I am certainly looking forward to reading it. If there will be a third.
We'll see. If one ever happens, we'll see. Don't hold your breath. This might be the end of reporting on Justin, so we'll see.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris. And yeah, I really enjoyed this.
Thanks for having me. It was really fun talking about all of the reporting and revisit. I hadn't thought about a lot of these things for a while, and no, it's great to talk with you guys. Thanks for having me.